Hello and very warm welcome to everyone watching us online. It is a real pleasure to welcome you to this conversation between Riga and Washington, D.C., two capitals that may be geographically distant but are very closely connected by the same questions about security, responsibility, and the future of transatlantic partnership. And as we all know by now, we are living in deeply unpredictable times. The United States is changing, and Europe is trying to understand how far, how fast, and with what sort of consequences. Washington is asking more from its allies. China is redefining American strategic priorities. The war with Iran is testing the United States' ability to manage escalation, and NATO, of course, still is under pressure to prove that political commitments can still translate into credible defense, right? So for us here, in Baltic states, Russia's war against Ukraine continues to reshape European security order. And of course, for the Baltic states, these are not just abstract strategic debates. They directly shape deterrence, allied presence, and the credibility of collective defense itself. And here in Baltic states, the future of the West is not an abstraction, but a strategic reality that is being contested in a real time every day on a daily basis. So with all that in mind, and with the fact that the United States is at the epicenter of many of those discussions, to help us make sense of where the US foreign and security policy is heading, and what Europe and the Baltic states should prepare for, I am very pleased to be joined by Wilson Beaver. Wilson is Senior Policy Advisor for Defense, Budgeting and NATO Policy at the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for National Security in Washington, D.C. Before that, before joining the Heritage, he worked as a policy advisor on the Senate Small Business Committee. And even prior to that, he also served in the United States Army. Is that right, Wilson?
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Sintija.
Thank you very much and welcome, and thank you for joining us and agreeing to share your, and to some extent, of course, the US perspectives on various issues that crosses our news feed on the daily basis. But first things first, the United States has just celebrated 250 years of independence. So congratulations once again on that.
Thank you.
I left DC briefly before 4th of July, and city was very vibrant, very cheerful. And of course, the period that I spent there, I learned a lot about the meaning of history, right? And specifically the Declaration of Independence. And that was, of course, defining moment for the United States, but its significance has extended far beyond America, right? It has helped lay the foundations for the democratic principles and values that still continue to shape the world up until today. So, Wilson, what does this milestone mean to you? And when you look at your country today, how do you think America or Americans has changed?
Oh, that's a good question. It was definitely a big event in Washington. The flyovers were something quite unique for people who live here in the city and all the people that were visiting. Uh, we've had a lot of very nice, very positive engagements with our allies, especially from Europe. I was at the Bastille Day party at the French embassy just last night, and the French ambassador gave a really touching speech about Washington and Lafayette and the history of the U.S.-French alliance going back to 1776. For me, I'm really quite thoroughly American. My family on both sides were here before the War of Independence. They were colonists, and my great grandfather was with General Washington in the War of Independence at Valley Forge. So, I think for Americans, there's a sense of continuity where we are trying to remind ourselves of the founding ideals of the country. And obviously, there's lots of division in American society, but I'm hopeful that this acts as a unifying event.
So my warmest wishes once again to you and to your people as you
Thank
enter this next chapter and carry the values of the past into the challenges of the future, right? And speaking of the challenges, those we have a lot to discuss, right, today. So if you look to the world sitting in DC, being American, right, being very much involved in think tank world and policy making processes, what are those challenges for the United States right now in July 2026?
Well, first, I'll make it clear when I'm giving my own opinion or the opinion of Heritage or when I'm trying to analyze what other people think, because the first thing that really needs to be clear to European and Latvian audiences is that there is not a unified opinion coming out of Washington. There is no topic more hotly debated among Americans than foreign policy, especially within parties. I would say Republicans and conservatives, we agree on most domestic topics, but we fight a lot about foreign policy. If you look at the debates that are happening among the various types of American conservative, foreign policy is always the most contentious one. But we do have some starting points. One, I think that traditionally Americans have mostly looked across the Atlantic. When I conceive of the world, I'm based here on the East Coast. Europe's far closer to us than Asia. Most Americans are still of European descent. And my whole life, we've been primarily engaged in conflict either in the Middle East or in deterrence operations in Europe. And we still conceive of ourselves very much through the lens of Atlantic history. But just as a military analyst, we're looking at China and trying to have the strategic discipline to make ourselves think more about Asia, even though it doesn't really come to us naturally. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union at its height was something like 50% the GDP of the United States. And now China is 2/3 the GDP of the United States. Their Navy is bigger than ours. I think ours is still qualitatively better, but quantity has a quality all its own. And their Navy is bigger than ours now. They have a larger surface fleet, and their fleet is always entirely in the Pacific Ocean. And on a good day, we only have 60 ships in the entire Pacific Ocean. And given how much of American trade and our just economic well-being comes from our relationships with the larger countries of Asia, we're worried that if China became a regional hegemon in Asia and just supplanted us and forced countries like Japan and Korea to redirect their trade towards China, Americans would become poorer and over the long term less safe. And China would become stronger and stronger and eventually replace us as the world's richest and most powerful country, which I think would be bad for all of our allies as well. So some of us have been trying to redirect American national security strategy to deal with competition with China. But there are a lot of other competing priorities. It's not what most people in DC have spent their careers working on. So there's plenty of people who prefer to keep doing what they've been doing or just have a vested interest in other regions of the world. And so we actually, even though our policy documents since 2014 have said that China is the major strategic competitor of the United States, I can easily understand why someone looking in from the outside is saying, when is that going to start? And where are the practical measures being taken to align U.S. Military activity with our national security strategy?
But thinking about China, I mean, we have heard that quite a lot, whether it's this administration or previous ones, we have heard that China is at the epicenter of Washington's thinking, right? But I think what it is harder for Europeans sometimes to understand how serious it is. You're right? There are trade wars happening. At the same time, there are high-level visits, very diplomatic negotiations taking place. So, and we have Russia here, and we can see that Russia cooperates with China. We see that as a threat. We see Russia cooperating with Iran as a threat. But I think the sense of how serious is the threat of China or how serious threats are being posed to United States from China is somehow missing. So when Washington says that China is the top priority for its national security, right? What does it actually mean, whether it's a trade war, hybrid operations, or really the possibility of a full-scale military conflict? How realistic is the direction towards conventional war? Because this was something that I heard in DC, right? But I think it's still
Sure.
hard to comprehend what it means to be in DC and locate China as the main security threat.
So I take the Chinese at their word that they are deadly serious about changing the status quo on Taiwan. I'm quite sure they would prefer to do it peacefully, but they've said I'm not sure how that would happen. And they've said repeatedly that if they felt that they were no longer able to peacefully incorporate Taiwan, they would do so by force. And I take them at their word at that. And if they were to forcibly incorporate Taiwan or attempt to, it would have drastic negative consequences for our friends in Japan and South Korea, primarily, but also for the region as a whole. And like I said, if they became the regional hegemon, which would be much easier if they controlled Taiwan, uh, American prosperity would suffer, and our allies all across the region would as well. Now, in terms of how likely is an open conflict, I don't want there to be a conflict, obviously. What I would like us to be doing is the sort of day-to-day deterrence that American troops did in Europe throughout the Cold War. We had hundreds of thousands of troops all over Europe from the end of World War II up until the early 1990s. And the idea was always to prevent a war from happening. And it's funny because American troops fought in combat throughout the Cold War, but mostly in Asia, even though Europe was the center of competition with the Soviet Union. So we had more troops most of the time in places like West Germany, but we were in combat in Korea and Vietnam and elsewhere. So the goal here is to deter China so that a war never takes place. And hopefully it ends with American strategic victory, just like the Cold War did, but without a major bloody war. Now, that would require a lot more U.S. troops in Asia. And that's what we're looking at. We would like to redirect U.S. forces so that we have more ships and more ground troops and more planes deployed to places like Guam and Hawaii and Japan and the Philippines and Korea. And it's also a different type of equipment that we need to be sending out there. We've a lot of our air and naval forces that were in Asia during the Cold War have been redirected towards Middle East and Atlantic operations since then. Most of our ships are still based in the Atlantic. Our biggest Navy base is right here in Virginia. And so we're not currently postured for the day-to-day deterrence that we would need to thoroughly convince the Chinese that they're not going to win a war, so they shouldn't try one.
Mm-hmm. So when you are saying redirect more troops, from where are you thinking to redirect them first?
Yeah. So for ground troops, that's not as big of an issue, right? This is more about the high-end capabilities like warships and aircraft. So yes, there are some things that we currently have in Europe that I would prefer to put in Asia. For example, we have some destroyers in Rota, Spain. I think that they're not needed in Europe, and I would much prefer to have them in Hawaii or Japan. We have some air assets that are currently part of NATO planning, and we're thinking that we might need to reassign them to Pacific planning instead. And that's one of the reasons that as the administration is pushing so hard on Western European countries to spend more, because we want them to replace the planes that we're pulling out of NATO planning and make sure that there is no capability gap as we reassign them to Asia. And one point I really want to make here is there's an issue in U.S. military planning that we call the simultaneity problem. Essentially, if there was a way to ensure, I don't know how you would do this, but if there was a way to ensure that China did not attack Taiwan, then if Russia invaded a NATO state, the entire U.S. Air Force would be available to help. Obviously, we want to prevent the Russians from attacking NATO states, and if they attack a NATO state, we will push back. We will fight them. But the question is, how many U.S. air assets are even available if there's a war in Asia at the same time? And so if the two things happen simultaneously, then we have to think a lot about balancing between the two theaters. And so our goal right now in pushing Europe to spend more is to make a lot more European assets available so that there's less of a simultaneity problem.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. And if you think about what is currently happening in Iran, and still Russian war against Ukraine, and if let's think about the worst case scenario, if China moves toward Taiwan, what would be the reaction of United States, let's say within a couple of months, is how you see that playing out?
Sure. So we've always maintained strategic ambiguity where we don't declare one way or the other. But the documents published by the Trump administration, I think, are the clearest statement the US has ever made that we intend to defend Taiwan. If you look at the national security strategy, it says that the defense of the first island chain, including Taiwan, is a core US interest, and we should position troops to make sure that the Chinese can't win a war trying to take Taiwan. And the national defense strategy talks a lot about the first island chain as well, and says, and that's the Japan on down to Taiwan, and says that if the Chinese broke through it, meaning took Taiwan and possibly some of the Japanese islands, because Japan and China also have disputes over islands, then it would be much easier for China to threaten places like Guam and Hawaii.
You mentioned national security strategy, and that is famous others to our side of the ocean, you know.
Yes.
Before we move towards the how it speaks about Europe, I wanted to bring in the Middle East and how it speaks actually about the Middle East. It actually suggests that the Middle East should consume less of US attention, right? Basically shifting away American attention and resources from the Middle East, just because there are plenty of challenges that you just described, right? So we're talking about National Security Strategy 2025, right? Yet, despite various attempts to achieve peace and a framework of cooperation with Iran, here Iran continues to draw in American military and diplomatic resources. What was that assessment in 2025 too optimistic? And probably you can also elaborate a bit, explaining the US rationale behind the decision to start a war with Iran, because the understanding here is really that it was unnecessary war, right? Taking into account the war in Ukraine, NATO challenges, and of course challenges in Indo-Pacific that we all face, right? So can you elaborate on that, on the rationale of doing that?
Sure. So I said earlier that foreign policy was the most contentious topic for Republicans, and I think foreign policy in the Middle East is the most contentious type of foreign policy. Uh, I'm sure if you look at statements by prominent conservatives, both in government and without, and from without, there are a pretty wide variety of views on the war in Iran. The Heritage Foundation, officially, our statement was that we support the president's efforts to make sure Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, but that we hope that the war is limited in time and scale and that there are no US boots on the ground, and that it should not be something that lasts a very long time and continues to serve as a distraction from our core priorities. And if you look at the NDS, it ranks regions of the world in current importance to the United States as Asia, Europe, Middle East. But currently, our money and troops are Middle East, Europe, Asia at the bottom. So I really do hope that we're able to get a quick conclusion to the conflict, because I worry about having fewer assets available in the more important theaters of Asia and Europe.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's I myself deployed to Iraq. So did my dad, for that matter. For a lot of conservatives, we we are we don't want to be engaged in what we call forever wars, where there are long drawn out conflicts in the Middle East. So we're hopeful that the Iran conflict is limited in length and scope.
You have some wishful date in mind that you would like to see it ending because now it's starting all over again, right? It seems.
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing now is that now that the war has started, you obviously don't want a bad outcome for the United States. And so even people that think maybe we shouldn't have started it in the first place, many of them will now say, okay, well, it started, we should win. And so that's, I think that's sort of a unifying position now, where we obviously want a good outcome for the United States, regardless of what we thought when the war started. Now, what does that look like? Very complicated, and I am not a Middle East expert. I much prefer working on NATO issues.
Yeah, but keeping you a bit on American thinking in this regard, since the war in Iran broke out, all the questions and challenges regarding the Hormuz, the oil prices went up, right? It affected everyday life also to ordinary Americans, right? And we have plenty of reports that represents what it means to U.S. economy, what it means to global economy, what it means to European economy, so on and so forth, right? We have seen the polls that public support for the war and for the decision itself when it comes to administration is extremely low, right? Also, the political frictions have emerged. There are those who support more, those who are against more, right? But then, as again, there is also a question of what this war actually means for U.S. defense, as you rightly explained, regarding the stockpiles, right, and the capabilities. And some reports are being quite harsh in suggesting that they are running out dramatically, specifically because of the war in Iran, and might become very difficult if China decides move towards Taiwan. So what is the calculus in DC? How much you can afford, how much longer you can actually afford to stay in Iran and in Hormuz? Thinking about
Sure.
China, thinking about Indo-Pacific.
So I absolutely think we have the necessary stockpiles and equipment needed to deal with Iran for quite some time. And if I were the Iranians, I would be taking note of that and thinking that this war could continue a long time if they don't come to a quick conclusion. You're right that the broader consideration is, what do our stockpiles and ready equipment look like for a protracted war with China? And there's there's two lines of thinking on this. One is exactly that. It's, are our stockpiles low? We fired a lot of precision guided munitions, and we have a lot of ships in getting their maintenance done now that they've been deployed for the better part of a year in operations, and there's sort of a concern about the China planning, and that's very valid. And that's one of the reasons that we are so supportive of the president's huge defense spending increase, which will bring us to above 5% of core spending. And I'm pretty confident that that's going to pass. Uh, the other line of thinking, which I think is also pretty valid, is that if you're China, or for that matter, Russia, you're looking at how Chinese and Russian equipment fared in Iran against American equipment and thinking that actually your stuff's not that good. Uh, there were concerns about like the F-35 for years, and I think they were completely unfounded. It's the world's greatest fighter jet. And if you look at the F-35's performance over Iran, Russian anti-air systems have not done very well. The United States has been able to cripple Iranian military forces, and we're also able to snatch Maduro from his palace without a single loss of American life. So, and that's in a country that has Russian and Chinese anti-air and aircraft systems that should have been able to defend their capital. So I think there's also a sense that even though there is a very valid concern about stockpiles, we should also remember what it must look like from Moscow and Beijing and think they must be worrying about the quality of some of their equipment after seeing how badly it performed in Venezuela and Iran,
Mm.
which is good. Good for NATO and it's good for the United States and our Asian allies.
And how do you evaluate bringing in NATO a bit from a bit different perspective from your security perspective? How helpful do you believe NATO partners can be when it comes to you dealing with China or NATO dealing with China more than NATO dealing with Russia?
I think that the primary goal of NATO should continue to be collective deterrence in Europe. Um, and it should also depend on the NATO ally. Like for Latvia, I would think it's 100% territorial defense, Article 3. I think that it was a mistake over the previous decades for NATO. And in a lot of sense, this is actually an American mistake because we pushed for it. It was a mistake to try to have every country in Europe with deployable forces for out of area operations in Afghanistan or Africa. It just doesn't make sense for every NATO ally. And if you're a country like Latvia, which is on the front line with a clear territorial threat from Russia, I would want Latvia to spend all of its defense on territorial defense, protecting Latvia, your borders. So, and I think that's actually our answer for most of NATO at this point. Well, even when we look at the larger countries like Germany, primarily we're just asking the Germans to take more responsibility in Europe, and we're not really asking for much in regards to China militarily. Now, diplomatic and economic messaging on China is extremely welcome. The Chinese are far more, they care a lot more about diplomatic signals than the Russians do, I think. The Chinese care a lot about their international reputation. They don't like being called out. They don't like being when they engage in bad behavior. For example, there are things that don't always get that elevated in European media, but which in Asia are a huge deal. A few months ago, the Foreign Ministry of China called for the beheading of the Prime Minister of Japan. The Chinese routinely attack Filipino fishing vessels and Coast Guard vessels and use fire hoses to blast them off the decks. They have territorial disputes with India, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. So the Chinese really are engaged in pretty broad bad behavior across the region. And from the American perspective, even though we're not asking Europe to do anything militarily with China, we would really appreciate diplomatic support against the bad Chinese behavior in international organizations and preventing defense technology from reaching the Chinese. So research security, which is something we have to fix too, by the way. America has terrible research security provisions. We have a whole long list of recommendations here at Heritage for Congress on how to prevent defense applicable technology from reaching the Chinese. And from the European perspective, one, it's very helpful to your allies if China doesn't get this defense tech. But two, the Chinese share defense tech with Russia, and it's good for Europe and America both if defense technology is kept out of China's hands. So research, security, and diplomatic signaling.
That makes sense, and that would require NATO to work much more closely within its partners. But the interesting thing that you mentioned that there's no military involvement necessary when it comes for NATO when it comes to China. But then we remember the President Trump was calling to NATO partners to help him deal with the Iranian situation, right? And that, spread a lot of disappointment, I would say, in DC, right? That those partners in NATO are not understanding our concern. Even though Baltic states were there and diplomatically supported and were willing to join the operation, right? The different question is how useful our support would be, right? But I'm just wondering how this need for military assistance, how the logic works for when you think about China and how the same logic can be applied when we remember the position of President Trump just recently when it comes to Iran.
Yeah. So, obviously, this wasn't really a NATO issue. It was individual European countries making national decisions. And the worst one by far was Spain. The decision by Spain to close airspace really was seen as an extremely negative move here in here in Washington, D.C. But as you know, that we think Spain's been a pretty irresponsible NATO ally in a lot of senses. The only one to reject the Hague 5%. If you read Spain's national security strategy, it actually blames America for rising tensions with China. So we don't appreciate that either. I think in one thing that I try to say here in Washington when we have these discussions is that we should be very strict with ourselves in differentiating between Brussels, the EU, NATO, Europe, and individual governments. They all mean different things. And so sometimes I do wish we had better messaging on if we're mad at Spain, we should say Spain, not NATO or Europe. Mm-hmm. Now, there are things that I think it would be helpful if some of the Western European countries did from the American perspective in the Middle East. For example, very little American trade moves through the Red Sea. Very little. It's mostly trade between Europe and Asia. And yet, even though the Houthis have been firing missiles at European shipping for years, mostly Greek and Italian and French, but they've been firing at European shipping for years. The only two countries that have fired back are America and the UK. And so people in DC will complain and say, why isn't the Italian Navy firing missiles at Yemen? Why isn't the French Navy or the Greeks? It's not American shipping that's being attacked, and it's not our trade that's under threat. So there are things that we think that European navies in particular could do that would be helpful in the Middle East. And I think that's the biggest one. Protecting European trade in the Red Sea. We just see it as something that is not a huge US concern, but something that we're doing without much support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
I'm talking about the Red Sea, not the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah. But going back to national security strategy that we touched upon when it comes to Middle East, it also is very interesting to read when it comes to Europe, right? You mentioned in the beginning that the transatlantic link is somewhere in a DNA also for American, right? It is the same for European. We consider the United States as the first partners, whether it's defense, economy, or just people-to-people connectivity, right? And then there is this document that is extremely critical towards Europe. Not just only towards European defense spending, but also meaning the NATO defense spending to some extent, right? But also of European political direction, regulations, migration policies, right? Institutional models. So does Washington still see Europe primary as an ally, or increasingly as a potential political and economic problem that needs to be reshaped? Or is it something else? How do you see, because it was in 2025, we are in July 2026, probably some things have changed.
Sure. So the first thing I would say is that it isn't new for the US government to take an interest in what Europeans would consider domestic issues. What is new is that Republicans haven't usually done it. Democrats do it a lot. The Democrats have been very interested in the internal politics of places like Poland and Hungary. And Democrat-funded NGOs have actually funded pro-migration policies across Europe. So from the American conservative perspective, we think that the Democrats have been meddling in internal European affairs for quite some time in a way that we find counterproductive and have largely stopped. Now, what is new is we think that a lot of the problems that we see in the United States are shared by our cousins in Europe. This is something that I've gotten the question about J.D. Vance's speech in Munich about 1,000 times at this point. And it's very similar to the criticism that you see in the NSS. If you read Vice President Vance's speech, well, he opens with, I love Munich, I love Bavaria, I love Germany, and I love Germans. I'm upset with the German government because I don't think that they've been listening to their voters. I think the German government has been bad on free speech and not listening to their voters' concerns about mass migration. And I just am offering that the German government, and he was talking about Germany, but it's actually even more true of the UK and France in many regards, should listen to its voters. And as you know, as allies, plenty of European governments have expressed opinions about US domestic politics. Our concern here is about free speech and mass migration. We think that there are issues that long term could have pretty negative consequences for a lot of Europe. Although from the Latvian perspective, we're mostly talking about Western Europe here. And the other thing I would point out about Vice President Vance's speech is that everything he said about Berlin in this speech, he said first about Washington. When he was running for vice president along with President Trump, he talked a lot about free speech and mass migration in America and said that these are like civilizational issues for Western civilization in both America and Europe, mass migration and free speech. American conservatives are radically pro-free speech. We really are. And that's a policy we pursue here in America. And so it is difficult for us to understand, especially some of the Western European governments putting people in jail for tweets. But the other thing, we really do think that mass migration is an issue that could have some very negative long-term consequences for America and Europe. And we saw it here first. We think it's a bad thing for Western Europe as well. And that's the gist of what's being put out in the national security strategy.
Okay, and then if we move towards to security and the question of NATO, and I think we have discussed this before, that it is not that United States wants to leave the NATO, but it's about a burden sharing, right? Because we have Indo-Pacific, right? So when Washington says that Europeans must take primary responsibility for their own security, meaning European security, is this still burden sharing within NATO? Or are we moving towards a new model in which Europe leads? And the other question is how far? And the United States are there to provide support only when it's necessary or only for the major crisis. What this burden sharing means in terms of NATO, probably. You can provide the insights from the DC.
Sure. Well, Heritage released our own special report called NATO 3.0 3 weeks ago. And essentially what we're calling for is, yes, the number of US troops in Europe should go down, but some US troops should remain. And the ones that do remain should move east, because we still want American troops in Europe to be useful and part of collective deterrence against Russia. So, for example, one of our recommendations is that the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, currently in Wilczek, Germany, should be moved to northeastern Poland. So that when we look at the Suwałki Gap, you have Polish, American, Lithuanian, and German troops all there within 100 miles of the Suwałki Gap to defend it against Russia. We are calling for Western European countries to put more permanently stationed troops in the Baltic states. We love the permanently stationed German base in Lithuania, and I just wish that there were a similar model for Latvia and Estonia. We want the US to increase the number of tactical nuclear weapons that it has in Europe and to establish sharing agreements with Poland and Finland so that it's even more of a deterrent signal against the Russians. Because we really, really want NATO to be secure so that we're not worried about the Atlantic if something does happen in the Pacific. The idea here is to convince the Russians that they can't win a war so they never try it. And we agree with you that the 3 Baltic states are the part of NATO most under threat from Russian aggression, far and away. That's one of the reasons I wasn't too concerned when we withdrew rotational troops from Romania, because I'm not that worried about Romania. I think that the number one threat is to the 3 Baltic states. And so we're working a lot when we talk to Europeans, to NATO Command, and to the Pentagon here in DC to center NATO planning around the 3 Baltic states. And I think that this message is getting out. You obviously, countries like Sweden, Germany get it, but there's others that haven't yet. And NATO plans, I think, are quite good. They might need some slight changes as European troops take more leading roles in some of the plans, but I'm confident that if European countries continue to increase their defense spending, and
Mhm.
I mean the major states of Western Europe here, obviously. The three Baltic states are already very good. But if
Is that
major
enough?
Western
And
European,
I will get to that. Is that enough,
yes,
right? But before that, on the questions that you just raised, uh, some countries that needs to take more responsibility about the security in Europe. You mentioned United Kingdom, Germany, France, obviously
France.
with the latest nuclear deterrence policy, right? As well,
Hmm.
of course, NBA, including also Finland. We are, in a front line when it comes dealing with Russia, but nevertheless, there are those states that you mentioned should take the guiding role of that. So how that idea is played out in NATO Ankara summit, how that one part of the question, the next part of the question is NATO genuinely more capable after the meetings in Ankara? Are United States satisfied with the results? And what do you expect to happen now within the next year when it comes to real implementation processes?
Most of us are quite happy with the summit. I'm very happy. President Trump said some very positive things. Most people in DC are quite happy with the Ankara summit. We saw major defense spending increases from most of the large Western European countries announced in the months leading up to the summit. There's been more pledges at and since it. And on the American side, one thing that we've been pushing for hard here is that we need to be helping European countries help themselves. And one of the main things we can do there is licensing American technology to Europe. And so we had several examples of this. The two best are obviously Patriot missiles for Ukraine, which is great, and the ATACMS deal with Germany, where now US ATACMS missiles are going to be built in Germany for the German military, and the Germans are able to export them to other European militaries as well. So I think there's
That in mind, with
yeah,
that in mind, when you think about European autonomy when it comes to defense and security within NATO, not outside of the NATO, uh, plenty of European states will say that it is also including our own industry development, right? You are
and it
saying
totally
you are ready to step into that. So I believe there might be some sort of challenges appearing, right? How far Americans come in and how far we are taking of ourselves, and whether developing our own industry or still relying on US industry. So what is the how do you view that? How much Americans wants to stay when it comes to European security? How much you want to stay in the Europe for that?
So I think it's right now it's not in a huge degree of competition because demand is so high that for a while I think that uh, everyone needs to be doing more. I think it's an and or answer. There are some things that America should continue to sell to Europe. The most obvious is F-35s, just because there is not a fifth generation European alternative yet. I
Mm.
mean, there won't be, but I am very, very supportive of Europe building its own sixth generation fighter jets. I There are even some people in Washington who are, including me, who very much are pushing for more European strategic autonomy for the defense industrial base because of the simultaneity problem. We say, well, if our focus is building fighter jets and missiles for first ourselves, then for Japan and Australia, and only after that for Europe, it's not fair of us to not encourage Europe to build its own industry up. And it's good for everyone if Europeans can are more autonomous in their defense industrial base. But I don't think that means no American defense sales. There's still stuff we'll sell. Um, there's still stuff we'll build together. I mean, there are things we buy from European defense industry too. The U.S. Navy uses a missile built in Norway, for example. And there's already things that we license for European production, like Patriot missiles are built in Germany already. And I think that stuff like that's actually the Rheinmetall builds part of US tanks, for example. There's tons of cooperation transatlantic in defense industry. And so I don't see it as being hugely in competition. And for the time being, we all need to be doing so much more that I'm just happy when countries have tanks or ships, and I'm not overly concerned about where they come from.
And that leads also to the comment that you mentioned on cooperation between research and defense technology, right? That is under one common umbrella still. Okay, about the 5%, I'm just looking at the time and we are running out of our allocated time. But regarding the 5% of GDP, as you know, Latvia and other Baltic states very fast are moving towards this goal. Latvia will be there just briefly. Estonia, Lithuania are already there. Nevertheless, other European countries are a bit far behind that plan when it comes to actual numbers. But still, we are in Baltic states. We are very concerned whether the United States would be there to defend us if Article 5 needs to be evoked, right? So is the 5% of GDP enough or is it sufficient for the Baltic state security from Washington's perspective?
Hey, I will not criticize any Baltic state for their defense spending. It's the highest in the alliance in percentage terms. When Americans look at Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, we see countries committed to their own defense who clearly see the threat and are, we always talk a lot about Article 5. Some European countries forget about Article 3, but the Baltic states don't. They are taking responsibility for their own territorial defense. So no criticism there. And if Baltic states wanted to spend more, that's a domestic decision for the people of the three Baltic states.
But is it enough for Americans to come in? Sorry
I see.
Being provocation.
No, I don't think that way. I don't think
if Russia would attack one of the Baltic states, what would be the reaction of the United States?
So I know President Trump has occasionally said things to the effect of how much people are spending. If you are using that logic, then absolutely the Baltic states meet the criteria as good spenders. But I would not say that's a common way of thinking for American conservatives or Republicans, and that's not how I look at it. I just say that NATO territory is off limits for Russia, and so I was in the 173rd Airborne, and my unit deployed to 2 years after I left, but the 173rd Airborne deployed to Latvia the day before Russia invaded Ukraine. That's what I would want us to do. If there was strategic warning that the Russians were preparing to attack a Baltic state, I would want to send a company or battalion of American troops to the Baltic states and prevent them from doing so. So I think if the vast majority of conservatives would agree that Russia is not allowed to attack NATO states no matter what.
Okay, what would the US stand to lose if NATO lost the Baltics?
Yeah, well, first, there are just a lot of Americans that genuinely like the people of the Baltic states and think it would be a tragedy if that were to happen. But also, I think that it would be bad for the security of Europe as a whole. The Russians would be empowered, emboldened. They would not stop there. They would threaten Finland and Sweden and Poland, etc. I do think that Russia's ability to project force is less than what it was under the Soviet Union, quite a bit less, and they've struggled a lot in Ukraine. They're a medium-sized regional power, in some ways declining, but with the ability to threaten, especially their smaller neighbors. And that's one of the reasons that we focus so much on the Baltic states, because I frankly don't think Russia is that big of a threat to some of its larger neighbors. But I do think it is very much a threat to the three Baltic states, and that's why NATO planning should be centered around that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you mentioned Ukraine. What is your calculus? What is your thinking about Ukraine? What is the most realistic scenario? What will Ukraine and Russia have to lose in order to end the war?
Sure. The president's goal has been clear from the start that he wants a negotiated ceasefire with the best possible deal for the Ukrainians. The goal has never changed. The tactics to get there have. At first, some pretty reasonable deals were offered to the Russians, and they were unreasonable and refused. And so now the tactics have changed. And the US is helping Ukraine in a variety of ways to weaken the Russian negotiating position so that the Russians have less freedom of maneuver and feel like they have to negotiate. So I'm hopeful that this combination of factors works and that the Russians feel like they can stop making such unreasonable demands and come to the negotiating table and agree to a ceasefire. When the war ends, I want Ukraine to maintain its military and ability to defend itself so that one, for them, and two, so that a large number of Russian troops have to stay down there in the Donbass, looking across the DMZ and not going back up north to bases facing across from you all.
Do you believe that the war can end with Ukraine regaining all its territory?
It's hard to imagine.
Okay.
Just as obviously I would like that, but I think it's hard to imagine. Russia is still a relatively competent regional power with a much larger economy and military than the Ukrainians. And just looking at the numbers and the industry available, it's really hard to imagine Ukraine taking all of its territory back.
This is the sentiment that I think starts to evolve also across the Europe, unfortunately. But just to conclude, when we think again back about US domestic politics, midterms are coming, Trump, post-Trump, probably also transatlantic relations. Where is the United States foreign and security policy heading? And what should Europe and particularly Baltic states start preparing for?
Sure. So midterms, I don't know. I think it could go either way. Obviously, as a conservative, I am rooting for conservatives to do well. If we look at 2028, I do think the most likely candidate for the Republicans is J.D. Vance. I have absolutely no idea who the candidate for the Democrats is. There's like 16 of them trying out for it right now. If you look at, so I think it would be good to look at the writings and the policy statements of Vice President Vance, but also Secretary of State Rubio, who has become very aligned with the President Trump's vision for foreign policy. Some things will change just because the way any president approaches things differs based on personality and their own individual outlook. But I think some things are likely to stay the same no matter who wins. And that's even if it's a Democrat. And that's that the United States has the same way that our European allies weren't spending enough on their militaries during the 90s and the 2000s, the 2010s, we weren't either. Our spending for the past couple decades is adjusted for inflation, half what we spent in the 80s and a third what we spent in the 50s and 60s. And at the same time, the things that we're asking the US military to do did not go down. We sent them to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they stayed committed to NATO and to our Asian allies. And so the US military has been stretched thin across the planet, being asked to do all sorts of things on a reduced budget. Now the budget's increasing now, but that takes a while to fix some of the long-term problems. And the world's not as easy from an American perspective as it was in the 90s and early 2000s, given the dramatic military buildup of China and regional crises elsewhere, the resurgence of Russian aggression. So I think that you're going to continue to see for a while in America looking for creative ways to balance theaters, asking its allies to do more, but continuing to try to successfully balance the theaters. And I think that if our allies do more and if we do more, then we can continue to have a solid alliance of Western civilization with the countries of Europe and America working together and maintaining the prosperity and security of both of our citizens.
Collective, right?
Collectively.
Not just defense, but collective approach. And just to really conclude, if you have to think about the Europeans or about Baltic leaders currently, what would you say? is the one single assumption that you believe we are getting wrong? What I mean, a lot of is being discussed about the United States and Canada and Greenland that we didn't touch upon, right? So, but what is the main single assumption that you would say we are getting wrong, and how we should be looking towards some sort of issues?
One thing that I think, and I wouldn't say this is the Baltic leaders in particular, but European leaders across the board get wrong is sort of an underlying assumption that America is making just choices instead of things that we see as strategic necessities. Like I said, I've lived 9 years of my life in Europe. I am of European descent. I look at Europe, and that's when I think about the international world, that's the first place I look. But as a patriotic American, I feel forced to think more about China and the Asian security world. And I think that we don't have much of a choice if we want to continue the quality of life and security that Americans have grown used to. So sometimes I think European leaders have a tendency to think, why is America doing this? Is it just like they don't like us anymore, or they think Asia is more interesting? It's not that. We really feel like we have a strategic necessity to think more about China.
Mhm. To be continued. Do you want to add something else? Say anything else?
No, just thank you very much for having me. I hope to make it out to Riga sometime soon. And just know that there are lots of people in both political parties in DC that have very, very friendly feelings towards Latvia and towards your Baltic neighbors.
Likewise. And dear Wilson, thank you very much for your time, for your insights, and being really a good friend for Baltic states, and really working together with us to strengthen our collective approach towards defense, and not just defense. Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you.